Thank you for all being with us this morning, and hopefully the lesson will be helpful to you and beneficial to you in some way as we continue to worship God together. Several years ago when I was still in school, I had a buddy that was a very vocal atheist, but we sat together and we would get to talk to each other about some things. I remember specifically one day he showed me this YouTube video that he had found. And it was just this guy presenting an argument as to why Christianity would not survive in the modern world. And he really loved the video. And he looked at me and he showed it to me and he said, I think this is the end of Christianity right here. It won't survive this guy. And my quick answer back was, well, then how did it survive Muhammad? This guy's on YouTube. Muhammad had one of the most powerful armies in existence at the time, but Christianity survived him. And he said, well, I think it's a good video. And that was at the end of our conversation. And many have proclaimed the end of Christianity, haven't they? And you don't have to be very old to recognize that. That if you've been on the news, you've been at school, you've been at work, wherever it be, you've met people that really have just proclaimed the end of Christianity, saying it's just not going to survive much longer. It won't survive in the modern times we live in. Our understanding's so much better. Christianity will be a way of the past one day. However, we've proclaimed the end of Christianity for thousands of years. Many of y'all remember in 1966, the famous Is God Dead on Times Magazine. And the writer was just making the argument about the changing of Protestant churches in America. And he posted the question on the title of the magazine, Is God Dead? Which is but why we have the song Our God Is Alive in our hymn books, was because of this article. And it made a lot of waves and people got really upset about it. So we proclaimed the end of Christianity in 1966. That's over 50 years ago. Was it the end of Christianity? Well, no, we're still here. And by the way, the Is God Dead thing actually is older than that. He got the idea from Frederick, German name. He got the idea from this philosopher in Germany in 1882. And he was writing a book about how the Enlightenment period of the 1700s and the late 1800s and how much we better understood the natural world during those times. He too, he proclaimed this was going to be the end of Christianity. And that was over 150 years ago. Well, was that the end of Christianity? No, Frederick, if someone could go tell him, it's still here, right? And as I already said at the very beginning, what about the Islamic invasion in the 600s, 600 AD? That was about 1,500 years ago. And if you think about some of the main objectives of the Islamic invasion that begins in Arabia, it ends all the way in Spain. I mean, it was a huge force. And it seems like the Quran was maybe written about 200 years later. And the religious element to all of this was that Jesus is not the Christ. He's not God. We got that wrong. And they were convincing many Christians to leave Christianity and join Islam. If you've ever had the opportunity to read the Quran, it talks more about Jesus than it does about Muhammad. And it's all about how Jesus is not God. This is the end of Christianity. You need to come back and be a part of this religion. Well, was that the end of Christianity? No, it's still here. And just looking at these examples, I think I can boldly say this. The way is here to stay. And of course, that's what the Christians called Christianity in the first century, the way. And the way is here to stay, even though many have proclaimed its end. And of course, we know this is true because it rhymes. No, let's look at Acts chapter 19. This is why we know this is true. Many have tried to end Christianity or end the way at its very beginning. And those attempts also failed. This is in Ephesus as just an example. 19 verse 9. Luke says here about Paul in Ephesus, but when some were hardened and did not believe, but spoke evil of the way before the multitude, he departed from them, withdrew the disciples, reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannus. When people spoke evil of the way and tried to proclaim its end, it just says Paul just moved and taught somewhere else in the city. Later in verse 23, Paul and the Christians become so involved in the work of the city and become so well known that it's hurt many of the pagan idol makers. And they begin to riot. Verse 23 of chapter 19. And about that time, there arose a great commotion about the way. And they start a riot. And the riot goes on for a little while. And then the city clerk sends them home. And the church of Ephesus just continues. And that's the end of the story. The way has been proclaimed its end over and over again for thousands of years. But it's always just continued. It's always been around. And I think that's some great confidence we can take in Christianity, that in fact it is here to stay. But continuing this argument of, well, if anyone was going to get rid of it, it's not going to be anyone in the modern world. I think we can make the argument that if Christianity would have actually been stopped or could have been stopped, it would have been in its infancy. It wouldn't have been when it has basically taken over the whole known world. If anyone could have stopped the way, who would it have been? Well, number one, let me make the argument that the people that really could have stopped it, if it could be stopped, would have been the Jewish elite at the very beginning. They had the opportunity to stop the way, but they failed. Look at Matthew chapter 27. Of course, the beginning of the way was Jesus. And it seems that the Christians named themselves members of the way based off Jesus' famous line that he is the way, the truth, and the life. In Matthew 27, Jesus, after preaching the way for 3 years, the Jewish elite brings him before Pilate to be crucified. Starting in verse 22, Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called the Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that the tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." Just to pause before we do verse 25. The Jewish elite goes and grabs Jesus at night. And they take him through all these sham of trials, and they finally get him before Pilate, the true authority in Palestine. And they say, "We need to crucify this guy." Well, who tries to come to Jesus' rescue? Well, Pilate does. But Pilate, with all of his power and his authority in Palestine, was he able to stop the Jews from murdering Jesus? No, he could not. He proclaimed Jesus innocent, finally washed his hands of the people and said, "Look, I'm not going to be a part of this. You do it." And look at their answer in verse 25. And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and our children." So not only do the Jewish elite are able to pressure the governor of the land into killing Jesus, but they also happily take responsibility for it. His blood be on us and our children. All the Jewish elite needed to do to stop the way was to kill Jesus and keep him dead. Now, under normal circumstances, which one would have been the more difficult thing to accomplish? Under normal circumstances, it would have been easier to keep someone dead because all you got to do is just bury the body and be done with it, right? Killing the person is much harder. But with Jesus, it was the opposite. Killing him was easy. Jesus was a willing participant of it. But the keeping him dead part was the problem. So were the Jewish elite able to stop the way? No, they kill him, they take responsibility for it, and he comes back. And people keep on talking about the way. Now, number two, if anyone could stop the way, and this isn't a typo, it would have been, ready? The Jewish elite. If anyone could have stopped it, they could have stopped it. Let's turn to Acts chapter 5. In Acts chapter 5, the apostles, after Jesus has been raised from the dead, seen by many, and the apostles are preaching the gospel. Here, the second time, they're taken into the Sanhedrin to appear before the Jewish elite, and they're going to try to stop the way again. In Acts chapter 5, starting in verse 26, the captain here has just captured the apostles in the temple, and he's brought them before the council. Verse 26, and the captain went with the officers and brought them without violence, for they feared the people lest they be stoned. And when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did we not strictly command you not to teach in his name, in this name? And they said, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood on us. Let's pause for just a moment. The high priest gets the apostles and he brings them in there and he says, you filled Jerusalem with this doctrine of the way. And then he says, you intend to bring this man's blood on us. But what did the Jewish elite say to Pilate about over a month ago? He said, his blood be on us and our children. And now they're like, hey, don't put this man's blood on us. We're dealing with the hypocrisy of these people. But now that they see that the way is flourishing, now that they see the way was not something they got rid of overnight, now they want to act like they had nothing to do with it. And I think this is demonstrating that the way has become a very large and powerful group here in Jerusalem, and they're trying to distance themselves from it. But verse 29, but Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom you murdered by hanging on a tree. Him God has exalted to his right hand to be Prince and Savior, to give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. And we are his witnesses to these things, and so also is the Holy Spirit whom God has given to us who obey him. Peter's like, we're just witnesses of what happened, and we have to continue to teach what happened. We have the power of the Holy Spirit that helps us teach us what happened, and that's just the way it's going to be. The council sends them out and debates. Gamaliel stands up for them in a way, but Gamaliel says this in verse 39, talking about the way. He says, if it is from God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you be found to fight against God. Did the Jewish elite try to overthrow the way? Yes, they tried like every time they got the opportunity to try. Were they ever able to overthrow this new movement that was only located in Jerusalem for 3 years? Were they able to ever get rid of it? It is still here. You know, and I don't know what's greater evidence for the fact that it really was from God than the fact that it's still here. We're still practicing it. And it could have been easily overthrown by the people that controlled the area and the people where it began. But it wasn't. Number 3 here, if anyone could stop the way, who would it have been? Well, would it have not been Saul of Tarsus? Couldn't he been able to stop the way if it could have been stopped? Look at chapter 9. Here's a young man who's up and coming, working for the Jewish elite, one of the elite himself. And this is what says his goals were in verse 1 of chapter 9. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogue of Damascus, that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? Then the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? Then the Lord said to him, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. Here's a man that has a lot of authority, a lot of power. He knows the high priest. The high priest has given him authority and letters that he can go to Damascus and he can go persecute the way up there too. And obviously he's very ambitious to do these things. But what happens? Well, Jesus just drops on him. I don't know a better way to say it than that. And now he's hit by Jesus. He has to enforce to talk to Jesus. He obviously recognizes he's God. He calls him Lord. I don't think anything else could have been God. Anything else could be but God. And he finally just says, Lord, what do you want me to do? And he's like, all right, we'll go into the city and you'll be told what you must do. I want to highlight one of these verses here in verse 5. Jesus says, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. And Saul, it's hard for you to kick against the goads. Do y'all know what a goad is? You know, a lot of us never had to pull a plow behind an ox, so we don't really have these analogies work for us always. But if you did, often what you would do is to get your ox to move, you'd poke it with a stick. Well, every once in a while, when that ox was tired of you poking it with a stick because he didn't want to go that way, what would the ox do? Well, he might kick back at your stick. But was that always a good solution for the ox? No, he just kicks into a hard stick and he gets goaded again to go in that direction. What had Saul been doing for a while he's persecuting Christians? Well, Jesus had been goading him in the direction, and Saul had been trying to just kick back at that stick. And it seems like the more and more Saul persecuted the way, the more and more he was conflicted about joining them. And finally, it seems here, Jesus just pushes him over the edge. You're going to join the way. And now here's our most powerful proponent. Here's our most powerful ambassador, Saul of Tarsus, whom we know as Paul the Apostle. And he probably would have been able to stop the way if Jesus had not overthrown him instead of him overthrowing the way. And one more here, number 4. If anyone could stop the way, it would have been Satan. Now, this is for us that are already believers and already convicted of these things. But if you ask a believer, if anyone could have stopped the way, who would it have been? Well, as believers, we would say, well, it would have been Satan. You can be turning to Colossians 2. But let me remind you of a few passages before we read that one. The end of 1 John 5, John says that Satan, or the wicked one, has the sway of the whole world. That he's the major influencer of the beliefs and the practices in the world. Ephesians 2, Paul says that Satan is the prince and power of the air, meaning that he's a principality, he has power, and he's very influential. Luke tells us in Luke 22 that the night that Jesus was crucified, that Satan entered Judas, and then Judas went on to betray him. And I just take that to mean is that the events of the crucifixion were planned and plotted firstly by Satan. And he was very influential that night to ensure that Jesus would be murdered. But this is what Colossians says about that night when Jesus was murdered. Look here. Now, before we read verse 15, let's just back up to verse 13. Colossians 2:13. And you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made you alive together with him, having forgiven you of all your trespasses, having wiped out the handwritten of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and have taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross, having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. And I'm all pulling this mainly out of verse 15. The night that Jesus went to the cross, Satan, at least to some point, believed he had won. You know, Satan had instigated the crucifixion. He had begun the process of making sure that Jesus was murdered by his own people. And so Satan and his forces, their plan was to make a public spectacle of Jesus. Because that's what crucifixion is, right? You know, crucifixion is not about executing someone, it's about shaming them. It's about making them a public spectacle that everyone could see. You strip someone naked and you nail them to a piece of wood till they die. So Jesus was supposed to be the public spectacle that night. But what does Paul say about what happened? The second half of verse 15, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. What's the thought? The thought is that Jesus was not made a fool that night. Satan and his forces were made a fool that night. And the spiritual beings everywhere were not laughing at Jesus for being murdered by his own creation. They were laughing at Satan for falling for a trap where Jesus got Satan to pull the own trigger that brought about his own destruction. Because that night, ended up being a sacrifice given for the sins of the world. That night began the process of the way where people could be freed from Satan and death's grasp and be in fellowship with God. And who was the causer of salvation being brought to the world? Who was the causer of Satan being defeated? It was Satan. He pulled the trigger that destroyed himself. So who was made a public spectacle that night? It was Satan. He was made a public spectacle that night. If anyone could have stopped the way, it would have been him. But was he successful? No, if anything, he acted like a fool that night. And every time someone obeys the gospel and accepts that free gift that was offered on the cross, who's made the fool? Satan's continued to make the fool, and he's been made a fool for 1,000 years. Now, we understand this. If anyone could have stopped the way, it would have been these people, but they all failed. Well, I think that next begs the question, well, why did all these people fail? Well, they all failed because Jesus is an overcomer. It's in his very nature to overcome, and that's what he continues to do for his people. Let's look at 3 passages in Revelation, and the lesson will be yours. The first one is in Revelation chapter 3. If you talk about Jesus being an overcomer, this is the book you end up going to. In the first 7 letters to these churches at the beginning, it always ends with the same thought. He who overcomes, I will give you this reward. Jesus says, if you overcome, I will give you this reward. And finally, at the last church, Jesus explains why he expects his people to be overcomers. In chapter 3, verse 21, Jesus says, to him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. Jesus did in his life have difficulties. No, Jesus in his life did have hurdles thrown at him. And even today in a different way, Jesus has hurdles thrown at him. Saul was persecuting the church, wasn't he? And what does Jesus say about that? Jesus says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? But every time a hurdle has ever been thrown at the Christ, what has Jesus done? He's overcome. He always overcomes. He's very good at overcoming. And what does he expect of his people? He says, I expect you to overcome too. Because this is what we do. We are overcomers. And of all the things that Jesus has been challenged with, he's always been successful. So I'm confused. I'm very confused when Christians become very discouraged about something going on in the world. I'm very confused when Christians would make comments like, well, I just don't know if we can survive this. I don't know if Christianity is going to continue. I don't know if my kids are going to have the opportunity to learn about Jesus because things are just so bad right now. Well, is Jesus too small for the latest and greatest bad thing in the world? You know, is Jesus just too weak to handle today's challenges? That's ridiculous, right? That's absurd. Jesus is an overcomer, and he always has been, and he always will be. And to continue that thought, Jesus overcame the largest empire in existence. Revelation 17, Jesus is dealing with the 10-horned beast, which is obviously the Roman Empire. Daniel makes that connection to the same metaphor. And here Jesus is fighting a cultural war with this empire. And look what it says about Jesus, verse 14, 17:14. These will make war with them and the Lamb will overcome them. For he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings. And those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. And I think what it's metaphorically depicting here is the Christian age taking over the Roman Empire. You know, you've got this little group of people that have started the gospel, they've started the way, and they're living in a very insignificant area of the world. And in just 100 years, the empire now is infested with people that are part of the way. They're so badly infested with people that are part of the way, they're having to take legal actions to handle the people all throughout the empire that are part of the way. Is that an accident? Did we just get really lucky? Or do we have Jesus, the overcomer, that eats the largest empire that has ever existed? And finally, one more passage from Revelation that I think signifies Jesus' overcoming nature. Look at Revelation chapter 20. I'm going to read verse 7 in just a moment. Now look, this is a difficult chapter, but don't get lost. There's no reason to get lost in this, and I think there's a really wonderful point we can make from this chapter. The section of Revelation 20 that's just ended is the 1,000-year reign of Jesus. And several Sunday nights ago, I preached a sermon, and we talked about that section, about the 1,000-year reign of Jesus in chapter 20. And what we decided that night, based on a lot of evidence, that the 1,000-year reign here in Revelation 20 is the kingdom age. It's the age we're living in right now. It's the age of the church. Jesus and the church on earth, right? And the end of that age would be the end of the world, because we're in it right now and we're waiting the second coming of Jesus. And if you want more information about that, if you look on our YouTube page, you can find that sermon and you can watch it over and over again to your heart's content. Now, verse 7 is the end of that kingdom age. Verse 7, now when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations, which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is the sand of the sea. They went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. And I'm going to pause before we read the end of that verse. What we have here is at the end of the kingdom age, Satan will be released for a little while. And the thought is that right now, Satan's in a limited state so the church can flourish. But at the very end, God's going to let Satan just have one more kick at it. You know, one more try like he tried in the first century. And Satan's going to collect alliances and other influential nations or whatever you want it to be to help him and assist him to stop the church. And these people are named Gog and Magog. Verse 8. If you come and tell me who you think Gog and Magog is at the end of this service, I will call you a liar. No one knows who Gog and Magog are. And there are no context clues in here to tell us who Gog and Magog are. They're two metaphors that were used in Ezekiel, and now John and Jesus are using them here for their modern audience. And all the thought is these are two nations that assist evil to go do evil. And that's the only message that's being said there. But what do they get together to do? Satan and his forces gather around the camp of the saints in the beloved city. And the beloved city is the heavenly Jerusalem. It's the church. It's the one we read about in Hebrews 12. So the thought is here at the very end, Satan is going to surround us. You know, at the very end, Satan is going to at least look in a way like he could actually do it. Like he could actually end the way. But what happens there at the end of that verse? Look at verse 9. Beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Jesus says, the moment it looks like he's going to win, I'll just unplug the game so he can't win. Y'all that are old enough, did you used to go to arcades? I'm not old enough to do that. We had that at home. No, if you went to those arcades, if you got a high score, you got to put your initials in, right? And it took forever just to get 3 letters. Did y'all ever have someone maybe that looked like they were going to take your high score at your arcade? Maybe they're playing Pac-Man and they might get to put their initials on top of yours. Did it ever occur to you right before they won and beat your high score, you could just unplug the machine yank that thing out of the wall, you lost. I don't know what other analogy I could use to describe this major event that we will all see. There's going to be a moment where it looks like Satan could actually win. And in that moment, what is Jesus going to do? He's going to unplug the machine. He's going to return. He's going to blow up the earth. He's going to throw Satan in the lake of fire, and he's just going to take all of us home. Now, does Jesus tell us this thing to scare us or to encourage us? I believe Jesus tells us this to encourage us. He's telling us it will never, ever get so bad that the way will be destroyed. It will never happen. That's what he's saying. And if it could happen, I'll just come back and move the way to its permanent residence. And it'll just all be over. That's supposed to be an encouraging thought. And one more thing. If this is going to be the case at the very end, what's something we can infer from this passage about the very end? For Satan to surround the church and the saints, does that mean that the church and the saints still have to exist on earth? I think we can infer that. I think that we can infer from this passage that at the very, very end, guess what will still be here? The way will still be here. And it will still be on earth even till the very, very end, because the way is here to stay. If the way is here to stay, and as a way of invitation, you can put your Bibles up if you like. If the way is here to stay, that means all of us as humans, we've got to make two decisions. We can go two ways. One is we can just finally submit to it and be humble enough to just say, well, this is just how things are going to be. And hopefully that would lead to a conversion, right? That would lead to someone being convicted of it and saying, well, if this is going to be permanent and this is going to be everlasting, well, for me to be permanent and everlasting, I'll just join it. And I think certainly that's the decision Jesus would like for all of us all to make. The other option is we can war with it for the rest of our lives. But am I ever going to do any damage to the way warring with it for the rest of my life? You know, if Muhammad couldn't stop it, and Paul couldn't stop it, and Satan couldn't stop it, what in the world is Andrew Smith going to do to stop it? Make a YouTube video? I have a YouTube page. Nobody watches anything. You know, no, I'm not going to do a thing to it. So I guess I'll just stumble on Jesus for the rest of my life and be miserable. Or I could humbly accept that the way is here to stay. Let's sing Faith is the Victory is the Invitation song. Here, bringing up the chorus that is Jesus who overcomes the world, and that's why the way is here to stay. If there's anyone we can spiritually assist, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing?